Hi folks, welcome back. I hope you're all doing well. Today I want to take a look at a paper which tackles the age-old question, what makes a good commit message? This was published just about a month ago at the International Conference on Software Engineering, and the reason this caught my attention was that commit messages are the closest thing we have to a narrative on the software that we write. There's also design docs, but they very often drift away from the actual state of the code. And so often when software engineers are doing some kind of archaeology to debug things, commit messages are a major source of information to help them. Now, obviously, this is a very subjective question, but the interesting thing in this paper is that they take a stand on that subjective question, but then they're also doing some empirical work on top of that. To come up with a definition of what a good commit message is, the authors looked to several sources. They looked at the existing literature, they looked at existing repositories, and they solicited opinions from experienced open source developers. And this might not come as a huge surprise, but the two basic elements that everyone seemed to agree should be part of a good commit message are the what and the why. What is changing in this commit and why it is being changed. And once they have that basic, somewhat subjective working definition, they do some empirical work on top of that by looking at some large OSS projects, trying to classify their commit history with this criteria in mind, and finally trying to then build a classifier that, given a commit message, can spit out some kind of judgment about whether it is a good commit message. This was their data set. They took a bunch of popular and large Java repositories, things like Spring, JUnit, and so on, and looked at its commit history. They cleaned up commits that were auto-generated or generated by tools, and their final data set had about 30,000 commits. Now on to the labeling problem. We want to take some of these commits and try to label them by humans as good or not, so that we can then build a classifier out of it. The authors of this paper looked at a random sample of commit messages and tried to classify them as good commit messages or not. And this was done independently. All the same, they had a pretty high degree of agreement. And finally, to cross-check, they even asked some outside open source contributors to do the same. And again, they got a lot of agreement with them as well. This chart is interesting because it shows the distribution of the types of commit messages. And with the exception of Spring over here, you'll see that all the other projects had half or slightly more than half of their commit messages not mentioning either the why or the what, or both in a small fraction of cases. So there's certainly room for improvement in the common practices for writing commit messages. And now that you have a nicely human labeled data set, you do the next thing that's a natural step, which is you try to make a classifier out of it. You train a classifier on this labeled data set. And they did that. They tried various techniques. The best one gave them accuracies of about 85% for identifying the why and about 91% for identifying the what. So they built two different classifiers. The idea is that you can use this classifier now to run over commit messages and maybe try and give developers some feedback on whether their commit messages are good or not before they check things in. So that was a quick look at a paper that looks at what makes a good commit message. While they made a subjective judgment, it was pretty universally agreed by a lot of software developers that in a good commit message, you want the what and the why of the change. They went ahead and looked at some open source projects and their commit histories and tried to build a classifier for good commit messages. So I'm happy that there's some investigation and empirical work in this area. I hope you enjoyed that, and I will see you all next time. Thank you very much.